Hi everybody, it's Dr. Hall, and now that we've talked about the female anatomy, let's actually talk about how those body parts work. So female physiology is today's topic. So we're going to break this down into oogenesis and then the menstrual cycle itself, and the next lecture will be about disorders that occur. So this image is all of the things that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about pretty much everything that's on here. Might look overwhelming right now, but hopefully before too long it will become very clear. So for 8A, we're going to talk about oogenesis specifically, right, which is gametogenesis for oocytes, creating the gametes, the sex cells in the female reproductive tract, which are called oocytes or egg cells. So the first thing is to remember, of course, this is going to happen in the ovary. So the ovary is the female gonad. That's where we are going to make the gametes. Remember, gonads have two jobs, to make gametes and to make sex hormones. So our gametes in this case are the oocytes. And you might recall from our previous discussion of anatomy that this outer rind part of the ovary called the cortex, that's where this process is going to be taking place. So that's called the cortex. You can see it labeled here. And the other thing that I want to point out to you on this image is that the formation and maturation of oocytes is going to occur in these little round sacs called follicles. So we're going to be talking a lot about follicles today. All right. So let's review meiosis. This diagram looks really confusing, but as we break it down, you'll remember. So the baby oocyte is an oogonium, right? And so we start with our typical 46 chromosomes. And then it's going to undergo the first two steps of meiosis, duplication and crossover. So now we're going to have double the number of chromosomes, and we're going to mix up the genes a little bit on each of them. And then we call it a primary oocyte. So you can see that here. Then we're going to do our first division. So here we go. We're going to divide this one cell into two other cells. This one on the top here is going to be called a secondary oocyte. And so that's going to have, now we're going to have a total of 46 chromosomes, kind of double copies of half of the chromosomes. And it's going to have all of the organelles and the normal things that a cell would have. The other copy that we make, however, here is different. This is called a polar body. And what it is basically just the chromosomes, just the genetic material, and none of the other stuff that's important for being a cell. Nothing. So this cell is going to be incapable of really doing much of anything. So we don't even really call it a cell, we call it a polar body. It's kind of just a way to get rid of extra genetic material that we don't want. So now, and it may go on and try to do second division itself, right? In which case, they're just going to degenerate and go away. Polar bodies can't turn into anything. So up on the top here, we have our secondary oocyte, the cell that got all the cellular goodies. And then it's going to wait to do second division until a sperm arrives. So it's going to hang out and wait, because it's why bother if the sperm isn't going to show up. And then it will go ahead and finish its second division if the sperm arrives. Here's the nucleus of the sperm. Again, creating a polar body, just a way to get rid of extra DNA, extra chromosomes. And then the cell that results will immediately fuse with the chromosomes from the sperm and become a zygote, or a fertilized egg right here. So meiosis in oocytes looks different from meiosis for spermatocytes. We look at them together. So you start with your gonium, right? So spermatogonium or oogonium. Undergo duplication and crossover and become a primary spermatocyte or oocyte. And then we start doing our divisions, our first and second divisions. And so at the end of those two divisions, in spermatogenesis, we end up with these spermatids that are then going to undergo spermiogenesis, where they slim down, get rid of all of their organelles, grow a tail, that acrosomal cap, and get all ready to swim to the egg. We can see in the case of oogenesis, as we go through these divisions, we keep shedding these polar bodies so that at the end, we just have one cell. And this one cell, this oocyte or ovum, is going to keep all of its organelles, right? It's going to keep all of that stuff because the sperm is not bringing any of it with him. The cell needs to survive. So since he's not going to contribute to the zygote in terms of Golgi apparatus and all the other things, the oocyte is going to have those. This is that same information in a table form with a bit more detail that I'm going to ask you to be responsible for. But it basically just shows us, again, we start out with oogonia or spermatogonia, we do duplication and crossover, now we call it an oocyte or a spermatocyte. Then we do our two divisions, right? And at the end of spermatogenesis, we have spermatids that undergo spermiogenesis to become sperm cells. And then at the end of oogenesis, we only have one gamete at the end. So why do we do that, right? Why not make 4 eggs, right? Why not maximize your chances of reproduction, right? Isn't that what nature is all about? So if you can, pause for a second, see if you can think why we might do this. Okay, so there are a couple of reasons that this makes sense, right? So first of all, since Mr. Sperm is not bringing any organelles, we want to keep one cell that has a full set of all the organelles you're going to need, the endoplasmic reticulum and the lysosomes and the centrioles. We want all of that stuff so that when the sperm arrives bringing nothing but his chromosomes, you have all the cellular equipment you need to survive. And so you don't want to have to split it in half twice, right? And then try to kind of have a, it's like having to, when roommates split up and then, one of them gets the shower curtain, the other one gets the dishes, right? You don't have a full set of anything. The other reason is we don't want to have quadruplets. So human bodies are not well constructed to accommodate multiples, right? We are best with singleton pregnancies. We don't really have a lot of room for more than one. And in fact, because of that, if someone has twins or triplets, they're almost always born prematurely or early because they just run out of room. Humans, we walk upright, and that really changes a lot of our structural anatomy. We also, in the case of oogenesis, are pursuing almost the opposite strategy of the sperm. So we're really focusing on quality. We're really focusing on making a really good product. So we're going to focus all our energies on just one really good cell. In the case of the sperm, they're making over 100 million a day, right? So they know that just by sheer luck, some of them are going to be good. So it's a difference of quality over quantity. It's a different reproductive strategy. There are other differences from the male system. And so as we mentioned before, when we did fetal sexual development, during fetal development, the ovaries aren't busy producing hormones in the XX individuals. They're usually just busy making baby oocytes or oogonia. And so in fact, at the time of birth, that is all the oogonia that a female-bodied person will ever have. They won't make new ones. So depending on when you start puberty and how long you continue to be fertile and when you enter menopause at the other end, anywhere from usually about 400 to 500 of those oogonia will become mature oocytes and be ovulated over the course of the woman's life. Now, the rest of them, however, because there's lots more, there's about 200 to 400,000 present at birth, are going to basically do a self-destruct. We call it atresia. So if the body just goes, no, we don't think you're good enough, and so they die off. So let's take a look at that. This is atresia, that loss of oocytes. And so what we're looking at here is a graph that shows you on the left side, this is before birth, so 0 is when you're born. And we can see this massive increase in the number of the oogonia. So they're being produced while you're in the womb. And then this red line in the middle is kind of the mean or the average, and the yellow and green lines show you kind of the range. So average population at birth is just shy of 300,000 oogonia. And then what you can see is by the time you're into puberty, so this is about age 13 here, you're already down to 180,000. So you've lost not quite half. And then by the time you get to 25, you're all the way down to 65,000. And by the time you're 35, you're down to 16,000. And it's not because you ovulated them. It's just because they were deemed unworthy. They kind of got past their expiration date, and so they just died. This is what that looks like, kind of looking at the total percentage of oocytes. So here's when you're born, you have 100% of your oocytes, and that quickly decreases. So here's age 20, right? You're down to already at age 20, you're down to less than half of what you started with. Here's age 30, right? You're down to just slightly more than 10% of what you started with. And age 40, right? You're down to just a couple percent of the total oocytes that you had. Now, of course, it only ever takes one to get pregnant, but it's got to be a good one. And if you have fewer to choose from, the likelihood it's going to be a really good one is lower. So for this reason, for female-bodied people, fertility peaks around age 23. So you are most fertile, most able to get pregnant around age 23, and then that declines initially gradually and then pretty steeply after that. So you're more than 50% less able to get pregnant by the time you're age 30. And then you're unable to get pregnant at all in the vast majority of people at menopause, so around age 50 to 52 on average. But there's a lot of variability, so that can be different in different people. So if you've ever heard somebody say, oh, well, my friend, she was on birth control for 20 years and then it made it so she couldn't get pregnant. So a lot of people will say, oh, birth control makes you infertile. But in truth, when they've studied it in depth to get that figured out, what you're actually seeing is the effect of age. Right? If you wait until your 30s to try to get pregnant, you are going to be much less able to get pregnant than if you tried to get pregnant in your 20s. And that's just a fact of life. It certainly is not impossible. Many of us have children in our 30s, and some people even have children, excuse me, into their 40s and beyond. It can just sometimes be a little more difficult. So that's a difference with males as well, because they make healthy sperm all the way from puberty, like they make mature sperm from puberty all the way until the day they die, pretty much, unless they develop some reproductive or hormonal problems. So they are making healthy sperm constantly, and hundreds and millions of them. So you might say, well, this seems unfair. Why is this that they get to stay fertile for their whole life? And so think about it for a minute. And then I think you'll realize the difference here is they don't have to be pregnant. So pregnancy is a significant stress and strain on the body. It takes a lot of fitness and health and resources to do well. And so this is actually a good thing that it's hard for female-bodied people to get pregnant in their 40s and later, because their risks of complications from pregnancies are much higher, because they are not medically quite as fit as 20-year-olds, for example. Okay, so some other differences from the male system, right? So not only are men making sperm up until the day they die every single day, female-bodied people only make one mature gamete per month, right? So instead of hundreds of millions per day, just one per month. So again, why do you think that was a good strategy? Why did that persist evolutionarily or evolve? Well, first of all, like we said before, we don't want to have twins or triplets or more, right? So imagine if I was releasing an egg every few days, then maybe I would get pregnant today and then get pregnant again a few days from now. And I would have twins, right? And then maybe again next week, and then I have triplets, right? And if that keeps going, like that could be a real problem. But even if they were just a couple of days apart, right, or a few days apart, we don't want multiples, right? That doesn't work well in general for humans. And we also are focusing on quality over quantity, so that's an important aspect. Probably the biggest reason, in addition to avoiding multiple gestations, is that it's actually not easy to get the endometrium ready. So that uterine lining, the womb, inside, the inside part of the uterus that has to get all thick and juicy and ready for a fertilized egg or zygote to implant, that takes time and energy to prepare. So you'll see in a lot of mammals that the females are often not continuously fertile, right? They will go quote, into heat during certain times. And sometimes part of that is to try to avoid giving birth heading into winter. So there's a seasonal component to it, so you don't want to have an infant when food is scarce. But it also is because it's energetically taxing to get a uterus ready for a potential baby. So you don't want to have to do that all the time. All right, so in summary, oogenesis is this meiosis that we do to produce egg cells or oocytes, also called ova or ovum is the singular. This is going to occur in the cortex, that outer part of the ovary, within these little round structures called follicles. And because of these polar bodies that we make, these kind of like, I'm just going to throw away these chromosomes, we end up with just one mature gamete at the end of meiosis. So that's really different. Also, female-bodied people start with all the oocytes they're ever going to have. Their fertility peaks around age 23, and they only produce one gamete per month, starting at puberty and then ending at menopause. So they don't stay fertile through their entire life. All right, so we'll talk about the actual menstrual cycle itself starting in the next lecture.